And I remember 20 years ago when I first came into Chicago, the acceptance of the Muslim community of issues which are now we take it for granted, like voting or participating in voting, moon sighting by calculation, or interfaith dialogue, has been evolving. And I think this is what Imam Majid has been talking about. Maybe we can discuss some of these issues in the Q&A session. And right now, I'd like to introduce Sister Aisha Al-Adawiya, the president of KARAMAH and the founder of Muslim Women Lawyers for Human Rights. She will be speaking about the roots of Islam in America. I'm reading a fascinating book called 1421, and it talks about how a Chinese Muslim discovered America first. A fleet of Chinese ships actually reached America in 1421, more than a century or half a century before Columbus. But I'll be eager to hear what you have to say about the roots of Islam in America.
Assalamu alaikum. I'm going to be quite brief because I would like to give us an opportunity to have a little bit of dialogue before we leave. I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to this very important conference. I'm very, very honored to be in this school. It's really an incredible gem in our community that must be preserved in a historical context so that we can have our own venue to interpret our own history and culture. So this is a very important institution. I'm so impressed with it, and I strongly encourage everyone to reach out, as you've been encouraged to do all along during the day, to find a way to support this organization. I'm going to read for you a statement from an enslaved African known as Omar ibn Said. And he says, "Then there came to our country a big army. It killed many people. It took me and walked me to the big sea and sold me into the hands of a Christian man." And that is how I would like to start my conversation tonight, talking about the roots of Islam in American society. And to do that, I'm compelled to invoke the transatlantic slave trade. As many of you probably know, that reputable scholars say that a large percentage of those Africans who were kidnapped, brought to these shores, the Americas, and enslaved were in fact Muslims. Now, the question that we need to ask is, what happened to those Muslims? What happened to their religion? How did they manage to preserve or hang on to any remnants of that? Are we their descendants? In New York, there is an African burial ground, a 14th century African burial ground, right in the heart of the financial district. But in the 14th century, that was the outskirts of town, and Africans were not allowed to be buried within the city limits. So they were buried in the African burial ground, which was the outskirts of town at that time. Now, how we know about this cemetery, and there are others in the country, is that there was a construction project going up in the Wall Street area. And as Allah would have it, they struck these bones, and they were the remains of our ancestors, many of whom were Muslim. So I'd like to preface my talk by saying that Islam is not new in this part of the world by any means. And to really advise, encourage, prod, and probe that we get beyond asking, do we belong? What is our identity? Why don't they like us or they don't know us? There are many people who don't know us, but there are many, many people who do know the history of Muslims in this part of the world. So we need to create avenues to gain that knowledge, that historical knowledge, so that when we begin to address the social inequities in our society currently, directed at the Muslim community, but no doubt having implications for all freedom-loving people in the society, that we are not trying to fight this battle with one hand tied behind our back because we don't know our own history of Islam in the Americas. So that brings us to the challenge of making sure that we begin to reach out, learn from those people who have been here for some centuries, practicing Islam, actively seeking out Islam as a way of life to save our lives because of the experiences that we've had in this country, subjected to serious injustice, and to remind ourselves that the challenges that we face today are really not new. And when we understand that these challenges are not new, that they've happened before, not only to Muslims or to African Americans, but they've happened to other people, we begin to find some courage to come out of our cocoon, out of our vacuum, and begin to build coalitions with other people who have already fought this fight and who have some serious strategies to teach us in terms of overcoming this kind of bigotry that's directed at us currently. And make no mistake, there are a lot of allies that we have in the society if we were just open up and reach out and be visible in the society. I took many notes during the course of the day, and I wanted to talk about changing the story, changing the narrative, because certainly post 9/11, the media and some aspects of our government have gone quite mad with talking about who Muslims are, what Islam is, how it treats women and other people in the society. And they've basically written our own story, and we've acquiesced and allowed them to do that. So that has to stop. And in order for us to stop that, we have to be engaged. First, we have to be knowledgeable, and then we have to engage other people and reach out to the allies, the natural allies, who would certainly support our cause as freedom-loving people. Now, the language that's crept up after 9/11, I must tell you that now, when we go for these interviews, when the media wants to talk about Islam in America and who Muslims are, it used to be a story that was backed with post-9/11 era. Well, now they tell us about the post-Osama bin Laden era. So how are we going to continually respond to these kinds of challenges that are put before us? The never-ending wars on certainly Muslim-majority countries. And how are we going to place ourselves to be effective advocates for social justice, not just for ourselves, but for everyone? The new language that's cropped up. We have language like Islamist. This is very new language, and I am baffled as to what it means. Underneath, we have an idea what it means. It's separating us from the mainstream. We are not the moderate ones, or somehow we are those practicing Muslims who may be suspect, right? So we have to push back somewhat. We don't have to necessarily embrace all of the language that is thrown at us, but rather provide an alternative or a new definition for the language that's being created in many instances to demonize us as opposed to describe us. Jihadist. We can't use this language. It's not acceptable that we allow ourselves to be described as jihadists. And this kind of language that is current and mainstream that everyone has adopted. And I understand that in academia, often many terminology, much terminology is imposed on the curricula, and you have to use that language. But we need to begin to give it our own definition, or just reject it outright and find new language. Now, one of the things that we've found is that there is a lot of cause for concern about how Muslims are projected in the media, which has resonance within our own community, again, because we don't understand our own history. The gentleman posed the question about the necessity to have a discussion next year about Islam in Africa, right? I mean, Africa is practically an Islamic continent. There's a huge swatch of people on the African continent who are Muslim. So we need to incorporate that into our discourse. When we see our children targeted and criminalized because of who they are, or what their names are, or what their ethnicity might be, or their parents' ethnicity might be, we in the African American Muslim community have always struggled for certain rights in asserting our identity as Muslim Americans. And I think that we have something very useful to offer to the larger conversation, both intra-community as well as outside the Muslim community. So it should not be a cause of fear or contention, but a willingness to be more fully informed of who we are as a community in this part of the world, and to gather all of our tools in the same toolbox. And then we can choose which ones we need to use at the appropriate time. But we have to now move away from the false notion that somehow Islam just approached this land, say 30, 40, 50 years ago. As the brother pointed out, there are scholars who are saying that Muslims were here some centuries before Columbus. Now, it's our responsibility to dig up and highlight that history. And there will be scholars who will push back and say, well, where's the evidence? And again, it becomes our challenge to produce that evidence. But it's really clear that African Muslims who were enslaved in this part of the world, and other Africans, built this land on free labor. And that's a claim to our citizenship. You know, we are here to stay. We are not going anyplace. So I would like to see us move away from questioning our identity as Muslims in this part of the world, certainly Muslim Americans, and begin to embrace our identity as Muslim Americans, and then be the really good citizen, dare to challenge injustice wherever we find it. Because when we do that, when we challenge, that is the best kind of patriotism, to invoke the right as citizens to say it may be law, but it's not just and it's not right. As the civil rights movement did, you know, it said, this is law, but we're going to overturn those laws because they are not just. And it's amazing how many other people in the society joined that struggle simply because it was the right thing to do. So I'll stop here, and I know I've gone way off topic for the most part, but it's a very important challenge before us, and I think that we can't move forward until we get to deal with some of the real issues on the ground, so that we can be effective in our advocacy and support of each other. Thank you.